Well, without question, Apple has figured out the formula for success. Co-founder Steve Jobs had a concept that permeated the entire Apple brand, and author Ken Segall is here to tell you about it. Stay tuned for Prudent Money. Welcome to the Prudent Money Radio Show. I'm your host, Bob Brooks, and it is so good to be with you today. You'll have to excuse us. I don't know really what this sounds like, but, I always talk about having a plan A and a plan B. Plan A is to go into my studio here in the office and come at you live through the wonderful world of technology. Then plan B is when the wonderful world of technology lets you down. And, our lines are down today, so I'm calling in to do the program, and wanted to come to you live today because we have a great opportunity, and waiting for him to call in. But Ken Segall is going to be my special guest today, and he's got a very unique story, a very unique experience. Over probably about 12 years, actually worked side by side with Steve Jobs, co-founder of Apple, and really he wrote a book, Insanely Simple: The Obsession That Drives Apple's Success. And in this book, he goes through all the things that make Apple what it is today, and it's quite a success story if you really look at where Apple has come from. What they went through, almost went bankrupt at one point in the late 90s, and how Steve Jobs came in and through his leadership and vision made it one of the most powerful brands on the planet today. And so we're looking forward to doing that. I know he's only doing radio spots today, and so probably on a pretty tight schedule and running late. So we'll be talking to him as whenever he calls in, and talk about his book that actually just made the New York Times bestseller list. And one of the reasons I like to do these types of interviews, because there's just such a great, lot of takeaway from an interview like this. I mean, from a book like this. This is, if you're running a business, I think this book applies to someone who's running a business, managing people, or just a career in general, about really what has worked. And these types of books that talk about principles and concepts that come from personal experience, I think are invaluable resources for us to be able to read through and say, that does make a lot of sense, and applying that to your own personal situation really can make a big difference. And, what's interesting is you go through a book like this and read some of the what he calls core elements of the culture of Apple that, of course, were a part of Steve Jobs' vision. When you go through and you say, well, that really probably doesn't apply to me, but boy, that is a valuable piece of information and something that you can practice. And what's interesting in going through this book, there's one core element that just is all the way through the book, and that is keeping it simple. And if you look at reading the stories and going through all the information in the book, you'll find that's one thing Steve Jobs did, was really keep things simple. Take the complexity out of it. I know from my standpoint, in reading through the book, that was something that really jumped off the pages at me, because we're constantly writing and constantly putting information out there, and I often wonder, wow, am I making it too complex for people to understand versus really keeping it simple? Very easy to do that when it comes to, of course, talking about money, and obviously, money is a very complex subject. So we will be taking this interview as soon as Ken calls in. And as I said at the beginning of the program, if I sound like I'm talking out of a tunnel, it's because I'm talking over the phone to you today, because Plan A didn't work, so we're working with Plan B. So let me tell you this. If you have a question for me, I want to invite you to go to the website, www.prudentmoney.com. And when you do get to the website, there's a lot of ways to get information and a lot of ways to keep up with what's being posted out there for you. And simply go to the Facebook page. You can like it, and by doing so, we'll receive the information that we're putting out there. Also, another way to do that is follow us on Twitter. And then, in addition to that, there's the Prudent Money e-letter, which is something that we're going to be starting to send out every week now with information, and kind of send it out more. We used to send it out once a month and just send you a ton of information, but now we're breaking it down to a weekly basis and keeping the e-letter itself a lot shorter, making it maybe going along with the Apple vision there, keeping it simple and giving you information there that we feel like you'll benefit from. And that's what I feel like I'm here to do with Prudent Money, is to go out there and sort through everything. Information is so extremely, extremely important, and it really does drive our decision-making, because you can't make good decisions if you don't know the pros and the cons. And that's what I want to bring to you, is that information, so that you can really determine what makes the most sense when it comes to his money, and our amazing responsibility of stewardship, which is simply nothing more than being a trustee over what God has given us. It's not something we own. It's something that he gives us, and it's something for us to manage. So all of that, the website. Make sure you're following us and signed up for everything. Also, if you got a question for me, and I do answer these questions, make sure that you go in and send a question to Ask Bob, and I will get that taken care of for you. All at the website, www.prudentmoney.com. This is Bob Brooks. You are listening to Prudent Money. We're waiting on a call in from author Ken Segall, talking about his book, Insanely Simple, The Obsession That Drives Apple's Success. In reading through it, it was real interesting in everything that made up the complexity of Steve Jobs, but it was very simple. And I've got Ken on the line. Hey, Ken, welcome to Prudent Money.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
Listen, if I sound like I'm talking to you out of a tunnel, we had to go to Plan B today, because Plan A was the ISDN line working, and it's not. So you got to love technology. Listen, I want to be one of the first to congratulate you on making the New York Times bestseller list with your book.
Hey, thanks a lot. It was really quite a surprise, but a very good one.
Yes, absolutely. What an accomplishment. Ken, I was reading through the book, and it just kept coming to me, boy, this just makes so much sense. Because there's that tendency to really make things much more difficult than it needs to be, when the reality is, simple's better.
Yeah, I think that's really true, and this book was really born of my experiences with other companies as well as Apple. And I think everyone has the same experience, where you go out to lunch with your friends and you sit there and you moan about, why do they do it this way? It just doesn't make sense. And it was interesting, because at Apple I never really had those problems, whereas with these other companies you would just imagine all day long ways they could do it better.
Well, it's funny, and you wrote the book as it's kind of a two objectives. First of all, you're telling some incredible stories of your experiences with Apple, but you're also teaching the reader core elements to really help them. And I got to tell you, as I was reading through it, I was going, oh, man, I'm doing it. I just don't feel like I'm doing some things the right way. It really does convict you of, hey, take the complexity out of it. Make it simple. In fact, you write about Steve Jobs had a concept called the simple stick. Talk about how he used that concept with everything at Apple.
Well, it was, people would go to meetings and they would work long and hard knowing what he was expecting, and yet he was still able to as they say, hit it with the simple stick. You would come back from a meeting like, oh, we didn't think of that one. Steve, it was like this common sense thing, which is, it really runs through the whole adventure for me. I was surprised how often his decisions weren't like the momentous, world-changing ones. The day-to-day decisions were largely just common sense. And in so many companies, common sense just doesn't work as well, because someone will say, well, clearly this is a better way to go. But someone else will say, yeah, but it's more expensive, it'll take a little bit more time, whatever. Steve just really cared about doing, the great thing, and those other considerations didn't get in his way.
Well, in one of the quotes in the back of the book, he said, this came from Steve Jobs, simple can be harder than complex. You have to work hard to get your thinking clean to make it simple. But it's worth it in the end, because once you get there, you can move mountains. And that is just so true. It's so much more difficult to take the complexity out of it and get it down to terms where it is common sense. People do understand it. In the book, you describe the intensity of Steve Jobs and his brutal honesty. How did that shape the company as a core element?
Well, Steve had this way of commanding respect. People followed him. He had this incredible charisma as well as the reputation for being a bit brutal when he needed to be. So he really was a fascinating figure in that he got all these reactions from people, and I think everyone has a sort of a different reaction, based on the type of person they are. But you really wanted to please Steve. You wanted to work 80-hour weeks if you had to, and there are a lot of stories out there about how people would perform above and beyond what they themselves thought they could do, just because Steve said, I don't believe that you can't do that. When they told him, I think there was a story in there, or not in my book, but somewhere I read about Steve Wozniak in the original Apple, and Steve Jobs telling Wozniak that you got to do this thing like in 1 week, and he said, that's a 4-week job. I can't possibly do it. And Steve said, trust me, you can do it. And he would sort of will people to outperform, and he did do it. It's just kind of amazing.
Well, I was having lunch with somebody today, and we were talking about your book, actually, and this was a friend of mine who used to manage mutual funds, so he's very familiar with Apple's history, and he said, I always think back to the days where, Apple almost just went bankrupt. And, of course, that was when Steve Jobs stepped back in. I mean, what an incredible story of success of bringing a company back from the brink. Yeah. What were some of the initial, just the key actions that obviously he had to move fast, that he took to not only save that company from extinction?
Yeah, my original relationship with Steve started back in the days of Next, when he was in exile from Apple. I worked with him on that business at his ad agency for 8 years. But when he came back to Apple in 1997, it was a disaster, and I had the opportunity to go back and be his ad agency creative director again. But it's one of those things, looking back at, everyone says, well, why didn't you load up the truck with stock? Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? It was a lot bleaker at the time, if you'll recall. Most people thought the company was soon to go under. But Steve really, I think, methodically put things together. He knew he had to first get the confidence of the public back and be seen as relevant once again. He wanted his first computer to really blow people away and show everyone that we meant business, and that was the iMac. And just bit by bit, the story started to become more and more positive.
Well, and if you were really paying attention to that story and what was happening at the time, what was interesting is that the media was just relentless on Apple, and from the standpoint of just almost convincing you that this company's gone. Microsoft is the king. Yeah. And how did he handle? And you write about this in the book. The naysayers, the adversity. I mean, how do you deal with that?
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is that you mentioned about all the bad feelings that were out there about Apple's chances of survival. The joke was that every article had the word beleaguered in front of the word Apple. You just couldn't read anything. And even when we started getting positive press, it was really funny. They would talk about the iMac is selling really, really well, and then the last paragraph of the article was, but Apple still faces great challenges. Everybody was, no one was willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. But I think Steve really doesn't listen to things like that. As you mentioned, my book talks about the ability to have the need to have confidence in yourself and not to listen to these naysayers, because they're all over the place. And there's some classic ones that come into play when Steve started the Apple stores. These people who are retail experts saying, I think the one was like, I expect Apple to be turning out the lights within 12 months on this disaster kind of a thing. And, here they are. It's like the crown jewel of retail.
Oh,
no one makes as much money as Apple in retail.
Yeah, I mean, that's just a pure pleasure to go into that store and just the branding experience that goes along with it. Hey, this is Bob Brooks. You are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. My special guest today is New York Times bestselling author Ken Segall, talking about his book, Insanely Simple, The Obsession That Drives Apple's Success. There's a lot of core elements in this book that really bring out how, really from the Apple almost at the brink of going away to the incredible force and brand that they are today. And Ken has had an unusual opportunity to be in there on the front lines with Steve Jobs, working with him, and taken everything that he's experienced there, that with a lot of other major companies, and really put together some great information that can help individuals who are running a company, can help people with their careers, and just I tell you, a lot of it is as you read through it, you'll go, boy, that's just common sense to do that and to keep it simple. One of the things you write about, and I love this because I'm a real stickler on keeping meetings and things like that simple. And you talk about a core element of think small, and I just love how they've taken that throughout the entire company's culture.
Yeah, it's really pretty impressive that they never throw tons of bodies at projects, even when they're like big, important ones. I make note in the book that in other companies it's very common. If there's a project, a new product, or whatever that is seen as critical to the company's success, they'll just throw every available body at it. You'll get 20 or 30 people working on something, and someone's got to sort through it all and make sense of it. And I suppose there's something to be said for getting a quantity of ideas, but at Apple and at its ad agency, really there's more of an emphasis on getting fewer people and smarter people. And Steve was amazing about hiring only the best and the brightest, and that's who he put his confidence in.
Well, that's so true, though. I mean, companies do this, organizations do this. They'll put so many people on a project, and it adds that layer of complexity in there. And of course, the driving force behind the brand, keep it simple, as you write about in the book. Now, obviously, a lot of competition back in the 90s and early part of the decade, where, and especially between a very intense competition between Bill Gates and Microsoft. How did he handle that competition?
Well, it's interesting. It was a competition, but Bill Gates was actually a friend. He would have dinner with him fairly regularly, and we would get reports at our meetings like, "Hey, I had dinner with Bill last night." It's just kind of an interesting insight because publicly they would sort of be at each other's throats. But there were opportunities. I remember one in particular where Bill Gates had given a public demo somewhere, and it blew up in his face. And I thought, wow, what a great idea to do a commercial. Let's use that video, and we'll put funny music behind it and whatever. So I made the big proposal to Steve, and he just looked at it and shook his head and said, no, we're not going to do that. He goes, you know what? That could be me just as easily. Things go wrong in presentations, and he didn't want to hit below the belt like that. Of course, I was an advertising guy. I was perfectly willing to hit below the belt.
Well, that's what's really interesting about him. Something that kind of jumped out of your book at me was that here you have a guy whose intensity is off the charts, yet he kind of displays, and tell me if I got this right, he seems like he more displays an intense confidence through Apple and himself, rather than an arrogance.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I never bought the arrogance complaint against Apple. I think if you're really confident and you do great work, Apple doesn't care to ask customers what they want. Steve had publicly said that that's not our job. That's not our customers' job. We don't want them to give us ideas. We want to run focus groups and find out what kind of products they want us to build. That's our job, and we want to create things that people couldn't possibly imagine. So I think also like the building of the Apple Store, going against the naysayers, I think confidence is a big, big part of it. And I don't think many people in the history of business have been as confident as Steve Jobs.
Well, you would have to have that level of confidence to be able to pull off what he's pulled off. It's an amazing story.
Yeah.
In the book you write that words are powerful, but more words are not more powerful. They're often just confusing. Many companies keep their words and phrasing in their efforts to brand their product. It's pretty complicated. Why does that end up hurting a brand in the end?
I think there's a tendency amongst most marketing executives to want to tell the complete story. They don't want to miss a point. We've got 10 things that make this product great. We're going to lay all of them on the line, and that's going to be even more convincing. And Steve's point of view was really not that every product had stood for something, and that was the main story, and that was what he wanted to communicate. So we would use fewer words, iconic images, things that registered very, very quickly, and I think in the end are far more effective than any kind of treatise on why you should buy something.
Well, of course, branding has been such a powerful force for Apple through the years. Talk about how the letter I of the Apple brand became such a powerful branding force.
Well, that's always a very amusing story for me, because I do feel a little like if someone made a movie about it, it would be kind of one of those silly movies about advertising with some guy in the room saying, "Hey, let's use the letter I," and it just sounds ridiculous in hindsight. But obviously, at the time, we needed a name for iMac, and it was a computer designed to get you on the internet quickly. So again, you could look back at it and say, well, it's kind of obvious. We'll stick an I in front of the Mac word. But at the time, it wasn't that obvious. Simplicity is really difficult to attain, and we had walls filled with names. And in fact, we had to present 2 times to Steve. He didn't like iMac. He didn't really see the value of the I. And we thought, well, there is a foundational structure there that we could do future products, and we ended up doing iBook and iLife and iMovie and iPhoto and all that kind of stuff. And but I think no matter how smart we like to believe we were, we couldn't possibly foresee the impact that little letter was going to have. But it certainly did provide Apple with a fantastic consumer branding letter.
Oh, absolutely. And what was so interesting about that, you had no idea where that thing was going.
Yeah.
Concept.
It's pretty remarkable.
Well, kind of final question here, Ken. Earlier we were talking about the intensity of Steve Jobs, and I thought it was something interesting in the book. You write about how you pose the question, how would you present to Steve Jobs? That if you could present to someone like Steve Jobs, well, you could present to anyone. How can someone be successful making a presentation to someone as iconic as he was?
Well, again, he was concerned about ideas, and he didn't care about the packaging of the ideas. In fact, if you showed him a presentation that was too fancy, he would get mad because, well, obviously you spend half of your time working on this presentation instead of the idea in the presentation. He was much happier to have an open, honest exchange of ideas, and you jump to the whiteboard when you want to make a point. He would do the same. He didn't like that formal aspect. I think for Steve, it was more about the purity of the thinking. What's a great idea? And I am hoping that other executives would work the same way. If someone came in to share an idea with them, that they wouldn't try so hard to bamboozle them or to manipulate them. It's just really, here's a great idea and here's why it's great.
Right.
That's the kind of meeting Steve liked to have.
And once again, a tougher way to do something, a presentation, but there's just so much truth to that. Well, hey, Ken, congratulations on the book. Once again, it made the New York Times bestselling list. Insanely Simple, the obsession that drives Apple's success. And I really appreciate you taking the time to visit with me today.
Well, I'm really glad to be here. Thanks.
Thank you, Ken. This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. If you missed any part of that that interview, you can go to the website. I do have the podcast. We'll have it up a little bit later on this afternoon. And if you want more information about Ken and the book, there's a link. Or there will be a link, let me say that, on the front page, and you can go check out more information. Also, while you're at the website, if you got a question for me, obviously didn't take questions today, you can go to Ask Bob and send a question in. I'll get that for you. And if I sound like I'm coming out of a tunnel, it's because I'm calling on a phone line, and typically we're all hooked up through ISDN lines and all that good stuff. But, got to have a plan A and a plan B. Plan A works when we use the ISDN line in the studio here, and plan B is when it's not working. And it seems to be the case ever since we moved. It's a hit-miss thing. Anyway, so hope the sound quality is okay. If you want more information, go to the website, www.prudentmoney.com. This is Bob Brooks. We are all out of time. Until we do meet again next time, keep the faith. Have a great rest of the day.
That's all the time we have for today. Questions or comments for Bob, or to find out more great information like what you've just heard, visit www.prudentmoney.com. Be sure to join Bob Brooks again for the next edition of Prudent Money.